Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a fascinating case study about professional identity, social barriers, and really the power of a tiny minority to spark systemic change. So I want you to mentally transport yourself to France. The year is 1982. And imagine a profession that was legally exclusive. I mean, a door just slammed shut against half the population purely by statute. That profession was the sage-femme, the midwife. For centuries, this wasn't just a women's job. It was literally defined by gender. The term itself translates to wise woman. And that wall finally came down, not because of some grand French national reform or an internal push from healthcare unions, but because of an external force.
Right, it was a European directive.
Exactly. A directive demanding the end of sex-based discrimination in professions.
And that external pressure, it just created this vacuum. It set the stage for a really unique kind of integration process. This wasn't just about, adding men to a roster. It was about forcing a change in one of the most symbolically female domains in the entire medical world. Our analysis today, it leans heavily on a detailed sociological study, Philippe Charrier's 2007 work, which tracks what happened when men started entering this field after '82.
So our mission is to understand how this tiny minority, and when the study was done, we're talking about only 160 men.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1% of the entire workforce. How did they manage the integration process? Did they do the predictable thing, retreat into the easiest possible niche, focusing on tasks seen as masculine?
Or did they do something else?
Or did they employ what the research calls these sophisticated logique sounds, or action logic strategies, that allowed them not just to survive, but to fundamentally challenge and maybe even redefine the profession's identity?
It really is a masterclass in how a minority can navigate a majority environment, especially when the initial resistance is rooted not in skill, but in these deeply held cultural beliefs.
Okay, so let's unpack that resistance.
Yeah.
The law changed, but why was it still so hard for men to, feel accepted or even to practice effectively? The historical barrier, it all hinged on one powerful concept: empathy. The social and professional consensus was that only women could truly access, understand, and connect with the experience of pregnancy and childbirth.
All of it. The pain, the trauma, the fear, the joy.
Right. If you couldn't share the experience, you couldn't possibly be a good sage-femme.
And that consensus was fiercely defended. When that 1982 directive came down, the professional women's unions, they fought it. Tooth and nail.
They saw it as an attack.
They saw it as an identity crisis. They viewed the introduction of men as a destruction of the profession's essence and the hard-won expertise that they, as a gender-specific collective, had cultivated over centuries. For them, this was an attempt to sort of neuter a highly specialized, historically female domain.
Okay, so the door is legally open, but the environment inside is hostile. Let's look at the men who actually walked through that door. Were these, dedicated individuals who felt a lifelong calling to the labor ward?
Surprisingly, the profile of the early entrants suggests, something else. They were typically young, in their early 30s, often from relatively modest backgrounds, so it represented a kind of upward mobility. But the critical distinction is how they got there. The study found that many of them entered the profession not by some singular dedicated vocation, but largely by what they called chance.
Chance in a specialized medical field. That sounds risky. How did that even work?
It links directly to the French medical education system. At the time, they had started filtering potential midwives through the first year of medical school, this highly competitive exam called the PCEM1. This is the massive bottleneck where students try to qualify for specialties like general medicine, dentistry, physiotherapy. And many of these young men had tried for those more. Let's say prestigious careers like medicine or physiotherapy failed to meet the cutoff and were then offered midwifery as a viable alternative based on their exam ranking.
So it was a second choice.
For many, the initial entry was pragmatic. Yeah. A second choice in a tiered system. The vocation, that often developed later.
That context makes this next finding even more compelling. In so many other feminized fields, when men enter, they follow a predictable route: segmentation. If they go into care work, they specialize in the technical side, the heavy lifting, the management track. They carve out a masculine niche to justify their presence. Was that the path they took here?
It was absolutely the expected path, but it was the path they actively rejected. Yeah. Charrier's key finding is that they realized that segmentation, just retreating to technical tasks or focusing only on administrative roles, it would be insufficient. It would make them specialists on the periphery, but not legitimate sage-femmes at the core of the birth process.
So if they rejected the easy out, they had to confront the core of the profession head on. They had to develop these highly advanced strategies, these logiques d'action, to integrate. So what was the first and maybe the most crucial strategy they used to deal with that empathy deficit?
The first strategy was, well, it was a brilliant rhetorical move. They transformed their lack of shared experience from a disqualifier into a source of unique, high-value professional trust.
How do you even pull off that kind of mental jujitsu?
By focusing on absolute credibility, think about the typical interaction. A female midwife, maybe having gone through childbirth herself, might subconsciously minimize a patient's reported pain.
Right, thinking, I went through that, it's manageable, or maybe she's overreacting.
Exactly. Whether it's accurate or not, that shared experience can create a gap in objectivity. But the male midwife, he can't do that. As the source material points out, he cannot say, it doesn't hurt that much, because he literally does not know the pain. He is forced by his gender into a posture of absolute belief and complete reliance on the patient's own report.
So the patient becomes the sole, undisputed expert of her own pain.
Yes.
And the midwife becomes the professional who has to believe her 100%.
Precisely. And this necessity, born from a lack of shared experience, inadvertently creates this new, strong foundation of trust. The man is positioned as someone who, because he can't personally relate, must defer to the patient's authority. This contrasted very favorably in some reported cases with female colleagues who might sometimes let shared experience blur the lines of patient-centric care.
That is a powerful insight. So they didn't fake empathy. They weaponized their difference to forge a stronger professional bond defined by trust. Okay, let's move to the second major strategy. How did they position themselves within the massive, traditionally rigid medical hierarchy of a French hospital? It says they pushed hard for professional autonomy.
Yes. They used their position as this high-performing minority to elevate the standing of the entire profession. Their focus wasn't just on doing the job, but on asserting that midwifery is a medical profession with defined competence. They were elevating it above the status of a merely paramedical role that just, follows a doctor's orders.
And we can see this commitment reflected in where they chose to work, right?
Exactly. The men overwhelmingly preferred large hospital settings, the big university or general hospitals, where the professional stakes were higher and autonomy was more attainable. Only about 13–14% of the men worked in private clinics, compared to over a fifth of the women. They saw clinics as places where subordination to doctors was just too restrictive.
And here's where it gets really complex, with the dynamics of gender and power. They were a male minority interacting with an overwhelmingly male majority at the top of the hospital hierarchy, the obstetricians. Did they leverage their own gender in those interactions?
They absolutely did, and this is a critical point. Male midwives reported achieving a significantly simpler contact and a less marked hierarchy with male doctors.
Simpler how?
They found they could often skip the usual institutional friction and shift quickly to a peer-to-peer relationship, sometimes even using familiar address like tu instead of vous, a dynamic that was routinely denied to their female colleagues.
Wait a minute, isn't that using male privilege to skip the line? If they're getting a simpler hierarchy with male doctors just because they're also men, aren't they kind of undermining their female colleagues' battles against that very same hierarchy?
That's the tension, and the study does address this. Their goal wasn't just personal advancement, it was professional autonomy for the patient. By bypassing that hierarchical friction, they gained space to assert the role of the sage-femme as a medically competent professional, not a subordinate. They used this leverage to strengthen their advocacy for the patient, ensuring that the absolute trust they forged at the bedside, that was strategy one, wasn't lost to medical authority in the institutional context. It was a highly pragmatic, strategic move.
Fascinating. So the goal was to make sure their voice carried weight as experts, and their gender became a tool to quickly establish that peer status. Okay, let's move to the third action logic, which involves the most symbolic act of all, the name itself. The professional body actually suggested new, gender-neutral names like maitician, but the men insisted on being called sage-femme. Why refuse the neutral option?
This was the ultimate assertion of belonging. They weren't trying to be a separate, parallel group. They were asserting their legitimacy as full participants in the historic institution, and they did this through a brilliant rhetorical reinterpretation of the name.
What was the reinterpretation?
They argued that sage-femme doesn't mean wise woman, the practitioner, but rather wise about the woman, the patient.
Oh, that's clever.
It is. By shifting the wisdom from the gender of the caregiver to the object of the care, they legitimize their full participation regardless of their own gender.
They literally redefined the profession's ancient etymology to fit their presence.
Yeah.
That's a mastery of the communication contract.
And this leads directly to another advantage they gained, the necessity of explicit communication. A female midwife, often relying on implicit understanding built up over centuries, might just assume a patient knows their role and boundaries.
Which can lead to miscommunication.
It can, but the male midwife is an anomaly. He can't rely on that implicit understanding.
He has to spell it out every time.
Precisely. Being a statistical anomaly forced the men to establish a clear, explicit relationship every single time. They had to introduce themselves, state their exact role, and define a contract with the patient. I am a male midwife. This is my role. Is this acceptable to you? And this necessity for explicit communication, which female colleagues often skip, resulted in what the study called a very clear and positive relationship and tremendous confidence from patients. The initial awkwardness was transformed into a powerful professional asset.
So the overall picture is of a small minority who turned every perceived disadvantage into a sophisticated professional strategy. But were they lone innovators, or were they building on existing tensions?
And this is the critical synthesis point of the study. This drive for autonomy, the rejection of subordination, the pursuit of higher medical status, this was not an idea invented solely by the men. It aligned perfectly with a movement already underway by a minority of forward-thinking female midwives who had been fighting for years to professionalize and assert their status.
So the men weren't the originators of the change, but they acted as a catalyst.
An amplifier.
Exactly. Their arrival provided a visible, highly motivated, and, crucially, a strategically leveraged group that joined and amplified this pre-existing ideological movement. Their visibility focused the debate, and their ability to bypass gender hierarchy with doctors gave the entire movement new leverage.
And this leads to an amazing, almost poetic paradox. We said that many of these men entered the profession by chance, right? After failing to get into medicine. Yet, the study concludes they became the fiercest defenders of the profession's vocation.
They did. They even expressed hostility toward the new recruitment system, the very PCEM1 system that brought them in, fearing it would dilute the profession's quality. They secured their integration by prioritizing and defending the core vocation that they, ironically, didn't even have at the start. They had completely internalized the ideal. So, to summarize our deep dive into France, when confronted with a seemingly insurmountable gender barrier, the minority of male midwives did not take the path of least resistance. They didn't retreat into a technical niche. Instead, they creatively redefined the profession's core competencies, transforming a lack of shared empathy into absolute trust. They leveraged institutional gender dynamics to gain professional autonomy.
And they weaponized their difference through explicit communication and that powerful reinterpretation of the name.
That's right. The sociological insight here is profound, and it raises a crucial question for you to consider, drawing on the conclusion of Cherrier's research. Does fundamental professional change in these historically rigid fields come primarily from breaking external gender walls through legislation? Or does it require finding and accelerating a pre-existing ideological solidarity, a minority movement for change, regardless of the gender of the individuals involved? Think about that next time you see a small group successfully shift the identity of a massive institution.